In today's episode of Power of the Mind, we explore depression. We talk about where it comes from, what it is. We ask ourselves, is depression something that is more prominent now than it has been in the past? Or has it always been around and we're just starting to notice it more? In general, we just discuss what is depression, where does it come from, and what can we do about it? Hope the episode is of some use to you.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to Talking Glass Media, Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Health. As always, next to me, we've got Greg Struve, knower. I like to say knower of all because he answers all of my questions.
True.
No,
that's not false.
We'll see.
That's false.
We'll see. But you see everything I throw at you, you're right there to answer it. So
yeah.
I want you to tell them a little bit about what you do and remind everybody.
I'm Greg Struve. I am one of the owners and also a therapist at Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare, which is I think relatively large size treatment center for drug and alcohol in Prescott, Arizona in the United States. And it also has a pretty solidly sized outpatient program. So the outpatient program provides treatment for all sorts of things, depression, anxiety, couples, and all the other things that you can imagine a person might need as far as their mental health goes. So
awesome.
That's what we do.
Yeah, I know we've talked a little bit about some different topics, but I mean everything always seems to come back to depression, and it's just and so that was kind of weighing on my mind the last week or so. And one of the big questions that was that kind of stuck out for me was just the back in my day, back in the olden days, back in my day, we didn't have it just. People weren't depressed, and
oh, sure.
And they probably were.
Reminds me of that grumpy. You remember the grumpy old man Dana Carvey used to do on Saturday Night Live? Yep. Back in our day.
Back in my day.
When I was a boy,
we didn't do any of that.
It.
Nobody
was depressed.
Depression. No, well, but there weren't. I mean, there were no counselors at school, and if you were sad, you just stopped being sad. And if you were upset,
it's true.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean. My parents never sat me down and were like, how's everything? How are you feeling? Like that never. And teachers,
Jerry Seinfeld has a show on Netflix called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And there's an episode where he and Jay Leno are reflecting on growing up. And Jerry turns to Jay and says, when I was a kid, my bedtime routine was the dark. Yeah. Like they just flipped a switch. That was our bedtime routine.
And it's, parenting is... Because back in my day, I'm like, but yeah. So
or when you ever watch Stranger Things on Netflix and all the kids are running around on their bikes in the neighborhood and you think,
yeah, remember that?
Boy, A, that's exactly how it was. Mm-hmm. B, that is not how it is anymore.
No, because we're all scared too. I'm like, I can't let them go outside. What's going to happen?
Sure.
So I just started thinking, and I know this is going to sound silly, but is depression new? Which I know it's not, but why are there more people depressed today than there were back in my day? Or are we more comfortable talking about it? Is it more, it's just, or people are realizing it, or are people just really way more depressed than they were back in the good old days, right?
Sure. There's a lot of questions there and there's a lot to unpack. The answer, of course, is that we don't really know. We can hypothesize. Right. Your standards for measuring depression, the tools that we have as far as the prevalence of depression within the culture, there are some tools that have been employed and used to measure those things over time. I don't have the stuff right in front of me, but I certainly can hypothesize about it. When we talk about depression, the other thing we can discuss, before we get to the space where we're even going to talk about, is there more of it now than before? We have to have a real significant consideration for what is depression? What does it mean to be depressed? And what did it mean to be depressed in the 1980s or the 1970s or the 1940s, right? What does depression mean now versus what it means before? So that's one of the really interesting things about being a clinician is you're dealing with things that are not necessarily measurable. So if I'm a surgeon, when I open up a body, I get more or less the same thing every time. And actually what's interesting is if you talk to surgeons, they'll tell you that everybody's insides are a little bit different. So that's kind of fun too. But you have kind of the same stuff you're dealing with, whereas as a clinician, it's all very, very subjective. I'm not going to ask you to bring me, a picture of a liver. I can ask for that. If you ask me to bring you a picture of depression, that's a much more subjective thing. Or love is another example I always use with clients. Say, bring me a pint of love. Well, science is the study of the measurable and the repeatable. And mental health is neither of those things as a general rule. It's a really subjective experience to have mental health and to have a sense of peace. To have severe or moderate or mild depression is all subjective, and it's all measured based on what? My own sort of litmus test for an experience. They don't talk about it anymore. They've changed the nomenclature for it. But back in the day, we had a diagnosis called dysthymia. And dysthymia was the diagnosis for like low-grade functional depression. So if you've ever heard of like a functional alcoholic is somebody who's an alcoholic, but he or she can still work. They can still function. And dysthymia was like functional depression. And that doesn't get talked about as much anymore. But that was really something that we would spend some time looking at back in the day. And that has sort of come underneath the broad umbrella of depression now. So the first question, I think, was, is there more of it now than before? And the short answer is maybe. We have social media now. One of the questions I put on my Facebook post, my Facebook feed, hey, does anybody have any questions for the podcast? And one of the questions was, what impact do you think social media is having? Which is pretty broad. And the answer to that question is we definitely do not know. We have no idea what impact it has, other than it's a significant impact. When people spend the number of hours per week on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok that they do, there's no question that it's going to have an impact, and a significant one. We just don't know what that is yet. But one thing that we do know happens with great regularity now is the tendency to compare my insides to other people's outsides. So what you post on your social media is something I'm going to compare myself to. And that is problematic and can be very, very challenging, because it's very easy for me to manipulate my image on social media and to convince you that everything is great, when in fact things might not be that great. So it's, one definition of depression is a feeling of inferiority, or a feeling that I am not enough, not good enough, or not measuring up in one way or another.
Well, and I know we touched on that a little bit last week when we were talking about the, when you're creating that image and you post a video or you post a picture, the first thing we do is we're clicking back to see, how quickly are people liking it? How many people are commenting? And, for, somebody like me, I don't care. I posted it, I don't care. But those teenage kids, that this is their measure of value now. How many people are liking my post, or did they like my fit, my outfit for the day? I'm trendy.
Look at you.
I got this.
That's
hip. I'm hip. I got it.
Hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, it's my fit. So yeah.
Educational.
But I think
it's so interesting how the whole millennial folks it's instead of saying totally, I just say totes. Totes.
For sure.
I'm going to shorten the word. I don't have time to say outfit.
No, it's going to be the fit. And I'm probably not even using it correctly. So I'm sure people will be going, oh gosh, that woman, she knows nothing about it. But but can you imagine every day having to check the value of who you are based on what people are, how they're commenting. And then, I like TikTok. I do all, TikTok and Instagram and stuff. And the first thing I do when I see a funny post or something is I go straight to the comment section, and you just watch like how many people are like super positive, but then you've got so many people like it's their job to just go on these comment sections and just tear people apart. And it's like, and it's so that anonymity to be, there's a word.
It'll do.
To be able to, just, you can just go in there and just say whatever you want to whoever you want, however you want, and people they just have to take
no
it. No
consequences, right?
So that for me, I would think that, you can't escape. There's no escape from.
Within the broader framework, being exposed to the darker parts of the psyche and the darker parts of the culture in a way that maybe we wouldn't have been in the past seems to me like it would probably move people more toward depression. That's pretty significant. If we're going to start off with a conversation on depression, we probably want to define it and talk about what it is. From a clinical perspective, depression is the experience of feeling down in a way that starts to inhibit your life and starts to inhibit the way you function in the world around you. And that's generally how it's measured. When someone says, I'm depressed, I say, okay, what is the impact of that depression on your life right now? And we talk about social functioning, family, professional, all those different areas of your life. How is your depression impacting you? And for some people with mild or moderate symptoms, it impacts their capacity to relate or to enjoy what's happening. And then with the more severe symptoms of depression, it impacts their ability to participate or be a part of it at all. Really, really severe depression, we get to a space where we can't really even get out of bed or function in the world. So it's a very interesting thing to work on and to work with.
Yeah, and I think of, back, we've talked about it, even on a couple podcasts back of just be happy, stop, get out of bed, do do what you're supposed to do. And so it's just mind-boggling to me that, we're in tune with it now, where we are more focused on it, but part of the reason for me wanting to do this podcast was because I deal with teenagers every single day.
Oh, sure.
And for me, I'm the girl that's always like, you're sad? Like, don't be sad. Like, just, and I have daughters and they're just like, oh, I'm just, my mental state today is just, I'm like, what are you talking about? Just like, why are you, to be better, like be happy.
Right.
And so I know there's a lot of people that think like me, or
absolutely.
And we've just been trained to be this way, but like I said, my parents never were like, oh, you're having a bad day. Well, it's, it's just like, that's unheard of. So don't have a bad day, turn it around. And so I just don't know how to deal with that. And, I'm not compassionate towards it, and I need to be, to me, I'm just like, stop, get better.
Well, one thing that I've found with mental health, because I come from a background of folks who were not, I didn't necessarily grow up in a family system that was focused on mental health. I came from a sort of blue collar background, and it was delightful. They're wonderful people who just didn't have much space for depression, for example, in their lives. And if you were depressed, too bad, figure it out.
Get over it.
Yeah. And, have you tried beer? I'll say that sometimes to clients. I say, well, have you tried? I've heard fentanyl is actually quite great for helping you feel better in the short term. It's not necessarily a recommendation, but it's certainly a possibility. The biggest thing that we see in the context of working toward understanding depression is, first, as a human being, I almost always assume that my experience generalizes to other people. So I assume that, and that's actually accurate a lot of the time. If I have a Pop-Tart and you have a Pop-Tart, and it's the same kind of Pop-Tart, my guess is it tastes just the same to you as it does to me, more or less. Mm-hmm. You might prefer a grape Pop-Tart to a strawberry Pop-Tart, but you're having the experience when sugar gets put into your mouth. For the majority of people, it has a similar and sort of pleasurable experience. And when we all watch certain TV programs or participate in certain events or have other experiences besides eating, we can assume that how another person experiences what we're experiencing, we sort of assume it's the same for most people. And what happens with mental health is people move into a space that they haven't experienced before, and they don't know what to do. So it can be very confusing for somebody, for example, if they spend most of their life not having any depression, and then something happens in their life that they're not able to address. They don't know what to do, and suddenly they find themselves depressed. It can be very disorienting at times. And in the same way, if I've never had an experience with depression, to watch somebody else have the experience is kind of disorienting. It's weird, and it seems like maybe they're faking it, and maybe they're and I think to myself, the tools that I've used, you should use. And I'm sure you can make yourself feel better because I've made myself feel better. Right. So what the heck is going on? What is the problem? And now the culture is starting to push us in a direction of having compassion in the context of depression. And I think that's probably beneficial. In terms of whether it's been around for a long time or not, my hunch would be yes. There were some studies done in the late 90s and early 2000s that indicated, for example, that if you came from Scandinavian heritage, the percentage likelihood of you having depression increased by about a third. It was pretty significant.
Wow.
And it had to do with just less serotonin in the brain. Super simple. Just a genetic proclivity to having a lot less serotonin in your brain. So that's what's really interesting is we sort of assume that everybody has a similar experience to us. And yet what we find is that someone's capacity to manufacture certain chemicals and someone's, sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's biological. One really interesting thing I do with clients when we're talking is trying to ascertain, is there a lot of depression in your family system? Was there depression growing up? Is it biological, right? The Scandinavian thing. Do you manufacture enough of this particular chemical? And if we find that's not the case, then that's where those SSRIs can be so handy. Those delightful pharmaceutical interventions that people, now they have some side effects and can be a bit of a challenge, but they have been a great help, I think, to mankind and to the suffering that a lot of us have endured over the years. So to answer your question, I think it's likely that there probably was and has been depression over the course of the centuries, and that the solution has simply been to grin and bear it up to this point. And again, I always come back to this idea. We have to remember that prior to a couple hundred years ago, there just weren't a lot of interventions for this sort of thing. The idea that there was an internal landscape, that there was even almost a sense of self. Freud, for all of his ups and downs, he gets a lot of crap. Poor Freud. I mean, he did do a lot of cocaine and had some interesting personal habits that probably were not greatly beneficial, but he really transformed the idea of how the psyche works. The idea that that I can change things in my mind, and that the way I look at things will then change as well, and that what happens to me as a kid matters. Up until the 1980s, they would sometimes do surgery on infants without giving them anesthesia because they assumed that a kid couldn't remember and it wouldn't be a problem. By the way, they do. Just because you can't remember before you're 2 doesn't mean it doesn't mess with you.
I remember when they took my son away from me when he was first born. They're going to go in and do the little surgery, and I went, you're going to give him anesthesia, right? He'll be fine. He won't remember. And they bring him back to me, and he's just, crying. I'm
quivering,
like, he remembers. He's, but.
And that is a shame. I've never met somebody who actually had that happen before.
Yeah, well, you watch him, you take him, and he's an infant, and he's, a day old, and it's time to do the, and so I'm like, yeah, go. I just couldn't believe that they didn't give him anesthesia for that. It's like, he's fine. He'll forget all about it. It was still going to hurt, but.
And what we discovered later is that the nervous system has the capacity to encode with material even prior to memory. So you can have, they end up being what's called an implicit memory, where you'll have a body memory, and it's a lot more difficult to work with or to draw forth, but it is in there, and the nervous system will respond to it.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Well, I just, for me, I wanted to, just to educate people, especially someone who is around teenagers a lot, and, from the olden days, how do I identify with somebody, or how do I see somebody that's depressed? What are some warning signs, or what are some things I should be looking for? And what can I do? Like, if I see those things,
Well, when I see somebody who's depressed, and the biggest warning signs that come up are changes in my social work/school environment, changes with family, changes in diet isn't the right word. People who are depressed often will lose their appetite. So that's pretty common as a part of the process as well. And in terms of what I do to begin with is I just notice and pay attention. So there are a lot of different causes of depression. So we talked about the biological cause. There's several psychological causes as well. One of them, probably the most common cause or root of depression, is just anger turned inward. Mm-hmm. When I have something happen to me, anger is the emotion that comes from the thought, this is not fair. So if something happens to me and I think it's not fair, I'm going to get angry. But then I have a decision to make. First of all, later I'll have to decide if this really wasn't fair. Because our perception of what's fair and what is fair can be pretty different, particularly as teenagers in general, but particularly teenagers right now.
Right.
So that's a big hunk of it. I have something that I perceive not to be fair. The next response is to bring up some anger. And now my anger can go one of two directions. It can go outward or it can go inward. In some circumstances, some family systems, some cultures, some environments, outward-facing anger is not a good plan. It's not going to work for you for one reason or another. There can be a lot of reasons why that might not happen. When you and I were growing up, it was not socially appropriate for women to be angry a lot of the time. There was strong social pressure for women to not be angry. And they would, you would call a woman who got angry a bitch. Oh boy. And that was a terrible terrible thing to be called back in the day. Now the culture seems to be shifting away from that pretty hard, but it certainly can be part of the process. If I grow up in a family system with violence, becoming angry at home can cause violence to come my way. Well, I might decide that I don't want that to happen. Or if I grow up in a family system with violence, I might decide I'm never going to be like these people. I'm never going to be violent like them, and I will never show my anger and let it out. And so in those situations, those are good examples of situations where the anger might end up moving on the inside rather than the outside. And what's interesting, particularly with the teenage brain, is a teenage brain, they look and act like adults some of the time, but they're still very childlike. You don't really have a fully developed brain until your early 20s. So for a teenager to process, my anger is happening because, I feel like this is unfair, therefore I'm angry, and as my anger is being processed inside instead of externally, and therefore I'm depressed. That line of thinking is a bit of a stretch, and frankly, it's a stretch for some adults as well. So clinically, what you do a lot of the time, if I have a client who comes in and says, Greg, I'm depressed, the first thing I say is, well, besides yourself, who is the person who's most affected by your depression? And it's a trick question. It's a magic question is what we call it in the field. Because the answer the answer to the question is always who they're mad at.
Really?
Almost every time. Yeah, almost every. I mean, I can think of a couple exceptions over the years, but it's a pretty easy test. And I'll sometimes do it in groups. Say, raise your hand if you're struggling with depression right now. And in a group of people who are early in recovery from addiction, it's going to be a lot of hands. Because it's tough to be in early recovery from addiction, and you are mad and scared and all kinds of whacked out, Yeah. Hands go up, and I say, okay, write down on a piece of paper who's the most impacted by your anger. And when they write it down, I say, okay, turn it around. Here's the trick. That's the person you're mad at.
Because you're lashing out at them, probably.
A lot of the time. Yeah. So, we as parents now have a lot of pressure on us. Back in the day, your job as a parent was to give people, the children, the people you were raising, a place to live and to feed them sometimes. That was pretty much the keep
them alive, right?
Yeah, that was the expectation. Roof over your head, give them some food. And then in the 80s, we realized, wow, everybody's kind of a mess. And we started to say, maybe we should do that differently. And so people have paid a little bit more attention. Folks started coming to Little League games, and you've seen that continue to progress for better or for worse. And I think it's probably for both, for better and for worse at times. But all that pressure to be a good parent can sometimes make a person a little bit susceptible to manipulation, right? Because I've gotten the message clearly that if my kid's depressed, it's probably my fault.
So I'm going to do everything I can.
I better do what I can. And one challenge I'll see sometimes in family systems is my kid is depressed because it gives them a place of power and control. Mm-hmm. So that'll show up once in a while. Now, that's a risky thing to talk about in a family system because some folks will latch on to that and ignore actual inequity in actual situations at home that are just objectively unfair.
Right.
Things that anybody would be angry about. Physical abuse is a good example, or having a parent who is living vicariously through me is one situation where I'll see a lot of depression come up. Actually, that's a great one. So I can think of a client right now, and the client was very high functioning and high performing, but she was also performing. And the reason she was performing, she had an alcoholic dad and a mom who was really, really what we call in the field, we talk about it as enmeshed. So enmeshed means I find my sense of identity in sometimes in the performance of my kid, but sometimes just in their well-being. And it's really common for one of the parents, often both of the parents in an addicted family system, to have a lot of enmeshment, to really define themselves by other people and by their quote-unquote success in parenting. And so now if there's some sort of challenge, for example, the kid wants the parent not to do that, the kid often feels a sense of needing to take care of the parent. So that's going to get in the way. And now all of a sudden, so I need to take care of you, but I'm mad at you. And I don't know what to do. I can't really communicate it. And so I just shut right down. So that's a common example.
As a cheer coach, I will definitely want to come back to that one.
Oh, cheer future. Coach. I didn't know you were a cheer coach. There's a lot.
So there's a lot of, never in my program, but you see it, where these moms and they're on the sideline doing the routines with their kids. And it's just, there's that definite fine line between I'm super proud of my kid and I never got to do this when I was a kid. So,
sure.
And, you can always spot the ones that are there because mom really wants me to be a cheerleader or mom really wants me to do that.
Sure,
so,
yeah.
And we've gotten pretty lucky in our program, but I'm always very careful of watching that and kind of watching those dynamics of, what is pushing that kid or what is driving that kid. Is it self? Is it, somebody from the outside wanting them to be a certain way? And I bet you find that a lot in like football too, with football dads.
Any sports, any environment can have that.
Mm-hmm. I think so.
And even non-sporting environments, a parent can just want their kid to be okay socially.
Yeah.
I mean, that comes up for me sometimes with my kids. I've certainly.
It came up for me all the time.
Oh yeah, man.
Yeah, with my kids.
And I remember I was pretty nerdy as a kid, and so my own stuff comes up.
Yeah.
If they're being mistreated somehow or having a hard time, I think, oh my gosh, don't say that, don't do this, don't do that, because really, I remember what that was like, and,
right.
And it's
you
still
try to protect them from being
right.
the goofball or whatever. But
right.
It's funny. My kids will always say, "I'll forgive you for what you did," but my mom already knows about it, and she's never going to forgive you for that. So because it was funny. Just, you protect your kids at all costs, but so
I think too, when we're talking about depression in the modern era, we're simply becoming much more aware of what it is and what we need to protect our kids from. Mm-hmm. There was written literature in my field in the 70s that talked about incest as happening. Oh, I can't remember what the number was. Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And he makes reference to the diagnostic manual in the therapy field talking about incest happening 1 in 10,000 times or something like that. And he said, I sat down with my clients and all of a sudden I realized I had 3 out of 10,000 people in my office, and it didn't make any sense to me.
Right.
So as he continued his process toward sort of uncovering that thing, there was a guy in California, and I can't remember his name now, but he developed a simple set of questions, 10 questions. They're called the ACEs questions. And they're a very functional way of measuring trauma that a person has in childhood. And for some people, they're very surprising. But the prevalence of sexual abuse in females, I want to say, is 1 in 4, according to the ACEs studies. No, it's 1 in 3. It's 1 in 3 females and 1 in 4 boys. So in particular, and that's not normed on, some sort of challenged demographic, right? This study was done in Southern California by Kaiser Permanente, San Diego, if I recall. Okay, so that's
not an inner city.
No, we're talking white collar for the most part participants in this study, and the stats are 1 in 3 and 1 in 4. Wow. Okay, so that is very, very different. And in the previous generations, it simply wasn't discussed. It simply wasn't talked about.
Which comes back to my question: does it happen more now, or are we just more comfortable talking about it, or we're okay to talk about it?
Well, the studies, this particular study we're talking about was done in the late 80s. And it would seem at the time, because the results were so shocking, it would seem to have been the norm. And when you're in my chair listening to folks talk about what happened to them, but also there are a lot of them now who know what happened to their parents and their grandparents, it does seem to have been pretty prevalent for a long, long time. Wow. It would seem pretty strange that we would wait until the time when, we had the most abundance in history to start damaging people at the level that we're damaging them now. I have to assume that we've been doing it for a long, long time,
Yeah, and probably a lot easier to get away with it back then. Who knows?
One would think. I did read, I'm an armchair historian, and I did read a book on the law in France in the 10th century, because that's one of the nerdy things that I do. And there were severe penalties for both incest and rape and all the sort of things that we think of now. So I don't think those behaviors are new. And I don't know that the prevalence is new either.
Yeah. And we had talked about before on one of our earlier podcasts of, people blocking out memories.
Oh, sure.
And being able to block that out. And I was always like, well, if you can block it, do it, right? Don't let it come out. But so that was, you can go back and check. Well,
and depression, so people get pretty wound up about repressed memories. And the caveat I'll give to folks is, if you do have a repressed memory, it'll come out when your nervous system can handle it. And most of the time, people don't have them. The majority of the time, people think they don't have them. That said, a lot of depression can be, for one reason or another, I don't want to, not necessarily remember because I have the memory, but I don't want to completely realize the impact that this experience had on me or that experience had on me. I don't really, I've decided that it's okay that my mom was distant the way that she was. And my mom was loving some of the time, once in a while. And I really want to dwell on that.
Right.
But I have this sort of nagging sense of loneliness and emptiness, and I don't know why. And then we sit down in the office, and after a few weeks or a few months, we realize, part of it is you really do have this, there's more going on. Excuse me. We realized that part of it is that there's more going on in the relationship with mom and with mom's distance, for example, than one would have expected.
Right.
Yeah. So
they tend to dwell on that a little bit more. You're finding out when you dive a little deeper, it's not just that she wasn't there. It was, more underlying factors going on possibly, or simply that she wasn't there and it impacted you much more than you wished. Yeah.
And it impacts you now much more than you wish. And we have to take a look at that or not, or continue to walk the same way you're walking now. Denial is the most basic form of self-protection a human being has, and I love it. I'm a big fan of denial. Because if we ever really understood how small and irrelevant we are, a lot of us would really come unhinged. Mm-hmm. If we ever really understand, the planet's been around, scientists tell us the planet's been around for 13.8 billion years. And we get 80 of those years, which mathematically is none. It's zero.
Yeah.
And during those 80 years, we have 8 billion other people to contend with.
Yeah.
So anyway, denial. Denial I'm a fan of. And also denial allows us to continue to function and to survive until it doesn't anymore. So when I'm talking about depression, I'm almost always talking about a certain level of denial in a particular area of some kind.
Well, you know me, I like walking around like this.
Hey, listen.
Love it.
I'm a fan.
Love it. Well, I know we can go, and I've taken you on a couple different journeys. What I'd like to do, would you be willing to do kind of a second part on this? And
oh, yeah.
And maybe we can, kind of figure out a deeper topic to explore a little bit more, because we've kind of brought up 4 or 5 or I always do that too, though. I always start on a path and then I take you here and I take you there. So
well, that's half the fun.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'd love to continue this and kind of just maybe have a better detail of where we're going to go and just really dive into that, because I think there's 10 different areas that we can explore. But if you're willing to, because I know we like to cover a different topic every week, but I think this is one we can really kind of sink into a little bit. If you're okay with that.
I'm in.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Power of the Mind. And, he loves to say, just make the world a little bit better today than you did yesterday. And I hate to take your catchphrase from you, but I've been thinking about that. That's been on my mind so much, of just, be nice and just be a little better today and take care of people. And so I really appreciate you putting that in my head, and just thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you guys next week.
Awesome.
Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Health. I always want to forget the health part. Thanks, guys. See you later.
If you have a question or something you'd like us to discuss here on Power of the Mind, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is stories, STORIES, at signalsaz.com. That's stories, STORIES, at signals, SIGNALS, AZ.com. Look forward to hearing from you.